Hello everyone, this is Cardmates, and today we'll talk about a continuation bet. In general, each player hits the flop about 35% of the time. If you're playing heads up on the flop, your opponent missed it more likely than not. Since many players fold when they miss the board, a continuation bet every time on the flop is the wrong strategy. It means that you have to bet your entire range, whether you hit the board or not. In general, when you first face an unknown opponent and don't instantly get reads on him based on his behavior, then you should assume that he will usually fold against aggression. A pre-flop raise, along with a continuation bet, is the best way to get reads on your opponent, and this strategy also gives you a good chance to accumulate chips. Example: blinds are 60 and 120, and 20. It's folded around to you in the low jack position with 49 blinds, and you raise to 3 big blinds with a 9 and 8 suited. This is a little more than usual, but with a stack of 50 big blinds, a 3 big blinds raise is acceptable. Only the big blind guy calls. This is a great opportunity to fire a default continuation bet of about 460 chips in the pot of 960. Your opponent will fold when he misses the flop, while continue betting when he hits it. Since your half-pot sized Cbet bluff should only work 33% of the cases, and it will usually work at least 50% of the cases, you now create a profitable bet. You must understand the math when randomly firing Cbets against opponents who stick to the straightforward player. Let's assume you raise to 2.5 big blinds from the middle position and the big blind calls. The flop comes down and you make a C-bet of 2.5 big blinds into the pot of 5.5 big blinds. In this case, to determine how often your bluff needs to succeed for a break-even play, you need to take, ready for math? The bluff amount and divide it by the bluff amount plus the pot size. In this situation, it would be 2.5 divided by open parenthesis 5.5 plus 2.5 close parenthesis equals 31% of the cases. Since you know that your opponent will fold 60% of the time, when he has absolutely nothing, your C-bet immediately becomes profitable with your entire range. Even if your opponent winds his range and defends with 50% of his hands, you can still C-bet profitable because your bluff should work in 31% of the time. Note that this does not even include situations where you flop a strong hand, when you're lucky to improve with thresh, or when there is an extra dead money from ends. This math confirms that playing against straightforward opponents, you can C-bet with any 2 cards. You can use a little more than math to figure out whether you should randomly fire C-bets against 2 players when you raise and get 2 calls. Let's assume that you raise to 2.5 big blinds and get 2 calls, one from the bottom and another one from the big blind. You decide to bet 4 big blinds into the pot of 8 big blinds. Your bluff should work 33% of the time. 4 divided by open parenthesis 4 plus 8 close parenthesis. To get an approximated percentage of how often both of your opponents are to miss the board, you should take 65%. There is the percentage of time when your opponent misses the board, and multiply it by another 65%. There is the percentage of time when the other player misses the flop. The probability that both players will miss the board is 65 multiplied by open parenthesis 65 close parenthesis equals 42% of the time. It means that both players will miss the random flop about 42% of the time. Since your C-bet should work 33% of cases, and it's likely to succeed 42% of the time, you still are in the situation for a profitable C-bet. However, it is much closer to the break-even play than when you fire a continuation bet against one player. So listen to this right now. If more than 2 opponents play in the hand, then the C-bet on any flop becomes a loose play. Okay, so what about when not to C-bet? Some flop textures are better for C-betting than others. In general, It is much worse to Cbet bluff on highly coordinated boards, which are often referred as wet boards, than an uncoordinated board is often referred as dry boards. However, it is also important to consider your opponent's range. For example, many players will Cbet their best hands from the bottom and call with speculative hands that include good high cards, suited connectors, and marginal pocket pairs against a pre-flop raise. It means that the boards with primarily median cards should be much better for a pre-flop caller than for a pre-flop raiser, especially if the pre-flop raiser generally sticks to the tighter strategy. Thus, it is usually better to Cbet on high card flops, such as Aj4, compared to median card flops, such as 9-7-4. Example: blinds are 20 and 40. Being a deep stacker, you raise to 3.5 big blinds with ace-queen offsuit from the UTG +1. Hijack and cutoff both call. The flop comes as 9-8-7 rainbow. In a multi-way pot, check and fold will be the best option for you. It is most likely that at least one of your opponents has improved to the hand that beats your hand. Even in a heads-up pot, you should seriously consider the check-fold option on this board. Note that the pre-flop callers ranges on this board are significantly stronger than the one of the pre-flop raiser, especially if the pre-flop raiser only raises with high cards and high pairs from an early position, preferring to fold all suited connectors. For this reason, the pre-flop raiser should often check-fold on median card boards, where he misses the board. You have to balance your game against strong players. This could lead you to check-call all your hands with showdown value, or with ways to improve your median card flops, with the intention of calling the turn and river bets with your showdown value hands. This makes it difficult for your opponent to fire random bets against you on the flop, as a check on the flop will not automatically mean that you miss the flop and plan to check fold. Whenever possible, you need to make sure that your checking range includes strong enough hands that you do not plan to fold. So, here's the thing. As the flop becomes multi-way flop, large in terms of the number of the players, boards that are usually good for the pre-flop raiser become not so good for Cbets. While the pre-flop raiser should usually fire Cbets at random on high cards boards or uncoordinated boards in heads-up pots, these boards are the best to check when there are a lot of players in the game. Again, such a situation occurs because there is a strong chance that someone has already hit the flop. Example: blinds 50 and 100. Your stack is 135 blinds, and you make a standard raise with ace-8 hearts from the low jack position. Cut off and big blind both call. The flop comes king, queen, and 7. The big blind checks and you check back. The cut-off bets 920 chips into the 1800 pot. The big blind folds. While you may have the best hand and some equity with your overcard and a backdoor flush draw, at this point, it's better to check and fold. As already mentioned, there is a strong chance that you are in the wrong position against at least one player. When you're confident that you are in the wrong position, then it will be better just to back off. Cbetting on dry flops. If a flop is super dry, example not coordinated at all, then you should be much more inclined to Cbetting even against two opponents. It is because there is only a small chance they will hit the board. However, when more than 3 opponents are playing on the flop, it is generally reasonable to check fold if you miss the flop. Example: blinds 50-100 and 10. It's folded around to you in the hitchhike position with a stack of 56 blinds. You raise with 9 and 8 of clubs. The cut off and small blind both call your raise. The flop comes king, 7, 2. The small blind checks. It is a good situation to Cbet approximately 250 chips. It is most likely that no one has improved on an uncoordinated board, so the Cbet would be profitable here. It is important to understand that the presence of a flush draw on the board is not enough to make that board highly coordinated. In general, as the board becomes more coordinated, you should avoid c-betting in multi-way pots. If the board is highly uncoordinated, you can c-bet even against 3 opponents without a hand. Playing against competent opponents. As your opponent gain a greater understanding of the game, this is, start to play better, you should c-bet less often. Many strong players realize that you will also miss the flop about 60% of the time, which means that if you c-bet almost 100%, then you would have air 65% of the time. If you have nothing 65% of the time, then your opponent can easily outplay you by checking raise the flop out of position, and by calling the flop in position with the intention of applying significantly aggression on the turn, referred to as floating. For this reason, you should c-bet less often when playing against strong players. But in general, you should c-bet on all boards where you can have range advantage. Basically, it means that you should c-bet on all boards that you don't have a lot of median cards and are not very coordinated. You usually check these boards intending to call bets with your made hands and full trash hands. Let's have one more example. Blinds 800 and 160 and 15. You make a standard raise with ace-king from the low jack position and only the big blind calls. The flop comes jack, 10, 8. The big blind checks. This is a great situation to check back and give yourself a chance to see the turn for free and get close to the showdown. If you bet against the opponent who has hit the flop, then this is a bad investment. If your opponent has absolutely nothing, for example, ace 3 or 6 5, then he will fold to any bet, which means that he is a good player. You also don't want to check raise because you have a fairly strong draw, namely a gut shot with overcards. While a bet can lead you to folding low pairs, other factors should make you want to check back. It would help if you consider checking with marginal made hands, especially when playing in position. The reason is that if you bet and get raised, you end up in a tough spot. However, if you check back, your opponent will often perceive your check as weakness, thus encouraging himself to bluff on the turn and river. By checking back with made hands and some trash hands on the flop, you make it harder for your opponent to identify your hand strength. This will lead him to bad decisions in the following betting rounds. Remember that you make money when your opponent makes mistakes. Example, blinds 80 and 160 and 15. You raise with king jack offsuit from the cutoff position and only the big blind calls. The flop comes queen jack 6. The big blind checks. This is another right spot to check back. If you bet and get called, there is no way you can find whether or not your opponent has queen, jack, 6, or a draw. If you face a check raise, then you will either have to call a big bet or be cautious and fold. But it's best to avoid both options. Though sometimes checking back will allow your opponent to catch the lock and beat you with the hand like 10-8, it's still worth the risk. If your opponent bets on the turn and river after you check back on the flop, you should be ready to call on the safest runouts. The strategy of checking back with a well-made hand is referred to as pot control and is considered to be a strong tactic, especially in tournaments where minimizing your chance of going broke is vital. In general, you should be more inclined to check back on the flop if the turn is unlikely to weaken your hand. Note that in the previous example, the ace is the only bad turn card. Any other card is safe enough. Although any diamond card is not an ideal option, it is quite tricky for your opponent to have too many flushes in his range. However, if there is a lot of turn cards that can decrease your hand strength to the second best hand in the game, a c-bet is usually perfect for making your opponent fold many hands that have good equity. Example, blinds 200, 400, and 40. You raise with 9-7 of suit from the cut-off position and only the small blind calls. The flop comes Jack, 7, 6. Your opponent checks. Now you have a middle pair, just like in the previous example, but this time any ace, king, queen, 10, 9, 8, 6, or any spade can likely beat you. If any of these cards appears on the turn and your opponent bets, then you will be left with a marginal bluff catcher and have to make a tough decision. To avoid this situation, you can bet 1,300 chips on the flop to fold if you were check raised. You will see that a bet often allows you to avoid many difficult situations. Besides, as you get more experience in dealing with difficult game situations, you will find that many of them become more manageable. If you always go for easy action, then it will be difficult for you to gain enough experience to cope with multiple difficult situations that you will eventually face. Cbet sizing. As the pot gets bigger and your stack gets shorter, you should cbet a smaller amount concerning the pot. In general, you should make a large bet, perhaps 65% of the pot size with a stack of 100 big blinds. But if you have 30 big blinds, then you should bet only 35% of the pot. When the board becomes less dry, you can bet a little more. Note that in 3-bet and 4-bet pots, your continuation bet can be fairly small, just 25% of the pot. Also, in 3-bet and 4-bet pots, you should be more inclined to cbet almost 100% of your range, because your 3-bet and 4-bet ranges should be significantly stronger than your opponent's calling range. Cbetting is a broad subject. It would help if you continuously estimated how flop connects with your range and how it connects with your opponent's ranges. If you have a range advantage on the flop, then betting any 2 cards is ideal in this situation. If your opponent has a range advantage, then checking is usually the best decision. It is also important that you take into account your opponent's playing tendencies. If you know that someone likes to check raise the flop with any 2 cards, then you should make a cbet, especially when you can counter the check raise. If your opponent is playing straightforward, you should bet with any 2 cards. Whatever you do, don't get in the habit of cbetting on each occasion or whenever you hit the board. Analyze each specific situation and take appropriate actions. To help you stay with the main points, let's sum up briefly. 1. Continuation bet is an excellent solution in almost 100% of cases when playing against straightforward players. And 2. As your opponent gets better, you should cbet less often. Well, that's it guys, thank you for watching. Now you know when it's necessary to make a cbet and when checking is a better option. Thank you for your attention, subscribe to our channel and give us a like. And if you have any questions, you can go to our website, cardmates.net.